Since appearing in Steam's early access store in 2016, much has been made of and written about Compulsion Games' mod-themed freakout We Happy Few. After teaming up with the newly found Gearbox Publishing and several reworks, We Happy Few is finally releasing 1.0 this August. But how much do you really know about the freakishly giddy inhabitants of Wellington Wells? Hi, I'm Jetset with the Leaderboard, prepared to go down the rabbit hole and hold tight to your joy because we're about to run down 7 facts about We Happy Few. Don't forget to subscribe and click that bell icon to become part of the notification squad. Compulsion Games, the company behind We Happy Few, is an indie development studio based in Montreal, Canada. Founded in 2009, the studio was acquired by Microsoft Studios in 2018. In 2013, Compulsion released the 1920s-themed fantasy adventure game Contrast on Steam, PlayStation Network, and Xbox Live Arcade. On June 4, 2015, Compulsion launched a Kickstarter for their new survival horror game We Happy Few. Pitching the game as a hiding-in-plain-sight survival sim, the studio flaunted the game's art design and freaky atmosphere. Kickstarter's community went nuts for it, and within a month, Compulsion had raised nearly 100,000 Canadian dollars more than their original goal of 250,000. Using not only integration of full-motion video but also a rockin' British invasion soundtrack, We Happy Few tells the tale of Wellington Wells, a small town in which the populace is drugged out on a new substance known only as joy. Taking joy is compulsory for all citizens of Wellington Wells, but as with all dystopian cities, the British hamlet has a small subsection of lawbreakers, the Downers. Downers are negative ne'er-do-wells who have stopped taking their joy and started seeing the world for what it really is. Fascinatingly, things have changed quite a bit between the initial Kickstarter pitch of We Happy Few and the game's launch later this month. In the original pitches of the game, Compulsion seemed much more interested in making a sort of social survival sim. In a 2015 interview, creative director Guillaume Provost described the game as Don't Starve meets BioShock. The idea being that the game would be an open sandbox world in which players could navigate. Players would have to balance meeting their basic survival needs with staying under the radar of the doped-up populace. As a result, there were a lot more survival mechanics at work. Players could starve, for instance. The scavenging and crafting system was more robust and was more or less the only way to progress your character. With minimal story at play, the game was mostly about this survival loop. How long can the player maintain their livelihood? Balancing food, thirst, and drug level before succumbing to the throng. The level of joy the player has in their system was a major mechanic for this iteration as well. The idea was that taking the joy drug was, to a degree, a necessary evil to progress in the game, and could even be used strategically. The enemies would become non-combative for a bit, and the player would get a slight energy boost. But coming down off the drugs would of course put the longer-term goals of thirst and food at risk as the players went into withdrawal. This kind of laissez-faire attitude toward drug use continues into the launch version of We Happy Few. Compulsion has stated that the game is not pro or anti-drug use, but simply questioning the so-called prescription society's over-reliance on drugs to fix every problem. However, this very quirky, indie artsy game is not the game that's launching later this month. At a certain point in development, as the game built momentum, Compulsion started to worry that the game they were making was not the game their players really wanted. Early access reviews of We Happy Few also reflect that. Players seemed to like it okay, but complained about a lack of structure and story for the world of the game. Ironically, this was actually done on purpose. In an attempt to not spoil the story of the final game, Compulsion limited the story elements of We Happy Few so as to just give a taste of what was to come. However, due to the reaction of the community, they realized their players might want more than just a taste. Heck, they might want more than the meal Compulsion was planning for them. After realizing how interested people were in the story, Compulsion decided to move forward with putting even more story elements than they had planned. Worried that their 20-person team wouldn't be able to handle the workload of pumping out a now much more massive game, Compulsion reinvested their Kickstarter earnings into themselves and doubled their company size to 40 employees. Along with this upgrade, Compulsion teamed up with Gearbox Publishing for help in the marketing on this now much larger game. To quote the developers, "Okay, you want this big old game with this big story? Then we'll build it." Gearbox Publishing is an American publishing studio based out of Frisco, Texas that's been around since 2015. You're almost undoubtedly familiar with their sister company Gearbox Software, who was responsible for notable video game titles such as Borderlands, Half-Life Opposing Force, Battleborn, and Brothers in Arms. So after joining with Gearbox, what exactly changed about We Happy Few? Firstly, since they were no longer the only mechanics that mattered, survival mechanics were tweaked pretty significantly. And by that we mean basically removed. Eating food and drinking water were changed, so they'd give your character momentary boosts, but not tending to these systems at all will make your character weaker in combat. You'll have to sleep sometimes, but not sleeping won't end the game, just make it a bit harder. That is, of course, a far cry from survival mechanics being the central point of the game, instead becoming essentially a buff-debuff system. Similarly, while there is apparently a permadeath option for more daring players, there's now multiple save slots, as can be expected in a story-based game. Finally, at the last E3, it was announced that Microsoft had acquired Compulsion outright, setting the stage for more projects to come from the Montreal studio. It's been a wild ride for We Happy Few and Compulsion. Starting from humble Kickstarter beginnings to rising the ranks amongst AAA companies, things have changed quite a bit over the years. Is it the game that was initially pitched? No, not at all. But rest assured that a sandbox version closer to the original game is coming up as DLC, and we're still excited for our first bad trip. Throughout the 20-ish hour adventure, the player will take control of 3 different downers: guerrilla scrapper Ollie Starkey, celebrity chemist Sally Boyle, and beleaguered everyman Arthur Hastings. They all come part and parcel with their own abilities, leveling trees, playstyles, and stories. The characters are played out in general isolation. There's no GTA 5 style quick switching here, but their stories do cross over, and moments of narrative connection deepen all 3 stories as a whole. The world is still procedurally generated, but less open. Occasionally, it will funnel you into more scripted story-based moments, which can happen anywhere in the town itself. So in effect, your goals will always remain the same for the character, but where you'll achieve these goals or find whatever items you need, well, that'll be new every time. This also means that each time you play, different side quests and items will become available depending on the whims of the game. While you might typically play video games to relax and avoid thinking about anything too deep, Compulsion has actually borrowed some pages from literature as reference for their blissed out English head trip. Some of them you've probably already encountered in high school English. For those of you who just Cliff's Notes your way through the class, Aldous Huxley's 1932 dystopian classic Brave New World also deals with a populace subjugated and indoctrinated through constant drug use. The joy drug in We Happy Few is essentially a rights-free version of Huxley's famously invented drug Soma, which is required by law and keeps the populace of Brave New World sort of content and passive. The main characters of the book struggle with what things and emotion in their lives have value if they're constantly high, all while participating in weekly government-mandated hedonistic activities, and they eventually decide to, kill themselves. It's a really good book, trust me. Funny enough, the developers of We Happy Few actually worked hard to balance the tone of the game to avoid it turning into a huge, never-ending bummer. The point, they said, was about providing a safe and fun environment in which to explore these issues, not just to make everyone depressed. Combine Huxley's druggy dystopian novel with 1967's short-lived but enormously influential dystopian television show The Prisoner, and you have the basic DNA for We Happy Few. Think of The Prisoner like 1960s Firefly. It failed enormously on release and then basically changed everything because the right people were paying attention to it. For instance, the Beatles loved it, apparently, even going as far as to let the show use their then brand new song All You Need Is Love in its trippy final episode. The Prisoner details the many attempts of an imprisoned ex-spy known as Number 6 to escape from a Mediterranean prison called The Village. At first glance, The Village doesn't appear sinister. It's beautiful and almost idyllic, but lurking under the surface is a darkness as evil as any that dwells in Wellington Wells. The Prisoner in particular informs a lot of We Happy Few's ineffable Britishness, and likewise tussles with issues like forced societal conformity and a seeming ineffectual struggle against an overwhelmingly powerful foe. Another obvious influence was, well, real history. Setting the game in mod mode Britain also gave the developers the means to address issues of societal conformity. As one of the first great teenager movements of the 20th century and the direct precursor to the British punk movement, mods were originally all about anti-establishment and vaguely hedonistic views. And scooters. Man, they loved scooters. If you ever want to learn more about this subculture, British rock group The Who made a movie/album called Quadrophenia, and it's terrific. It's basically the mod movement codified into film, and it packs all the youthful rebellion, bitter teen angst, and rocking fashion that you could possibly squeeze into 2 hours of celluloid. While mod subculture was a hugely popular movement that tore through Britain's post-war youth, as with all movements teenagers blazed for themselves, the mod subculture was quickly weaponized by advertising and made cool cool. This, of course, brings up the question, what does an anti-establishment movement do when the establishment embraces it? Does it mean anything to be against the system when the system expects and wants you to be that way so it can sell you things? All of these questions of conformity versus non-conformity and the nature of those two labels were woven into We Happy Few from conception, and the time period it's set in addresses those questions seamlessly. However, the mod movement wasn't the only inspiration taken from this time in British history. To contrast the dark, gritty vibes of the mods, We Happy Few also takes influence from another more mainstream mentality of the 60s, revolutionary optimism. This came from a desire to push away the dark times of war with an obsession over a bright future. This sort of thinking is where the futurism and bright colors of the game's aesthetic comes from. Combining this with the mod influences makes for a game that clashes stylistically in ways that, likely purposefully, mirror the conflict between the downers and the joy-taking wellies. One much publicized fact about We Happy Few is that it had a few entanglements with the notoriously thorny Australian censorship board. You probably know this, but Australia has a more puritanical system than most when it comes to screening video games for import. Essentially, if the game were to get the equivalent of an AO rating down under, it would be refused classification and rejected from being sold in uncensored form. Some games that are still not available uncensored in Australia include Hotline Miami 2, Manhunt, Postal 1 and 2, The Witcher 2, and South Park: Stick of Truth, among many more. We Happy Few actually had some trouble with this board. Initially, the game was given the dreaded banned rating because of the mechanics related to the player taking joy, as we mentioned can sometimes aid progress through Wellington Wells. The Australian board ruled that joy constitutes an incentive or reward for drug use, and therefore the game exceeds the R18+ classification that states drug use related to incentives and rewards is not permitted. Gearbox appealed the rating, speaking to the board and attempting to explain that while the joy mechanics could occasionally aid progress, the overall point of the game was to reject the programming and fight back. The board eventually overturned their ruling and is allowing We Happy Few to release uncensored in Australia, albeit with their highest rating. Let's hear it for cool heads and contextualizing potentially inflammatory content. The world needs more context these days. I'm Jetset, and I hope you enjoyed 7 facts about We Happy Few. If you want to see more videos like this one, subscribe to The Leaderboard, your home for video game facts.